They noticed. That is the part you have not fully allowed yourself to consider. Not immediately, but in the days that followed your silence, something shifted in the people who had grown comfortable with your presence. Not loudly, not with any admission they would speak out loud, but in the quiet moments, in the spaces where your voice used to arrive without effort, there was suddenly a weight they could not account for. You did not leave with a declaration. You did not demand to be missed. You simply became unavailable to the explanations, to the patience, to the version of yourself that had spent too long being taken for granted. And that unavailability communicated something that every word you had ever spoken could not. It told them without a single sentence that what they had access to was never permanent, and they felt it before they could name it. There is a meaningful difference between disappearing and withdrawing, and the people left behind feel that difference even when they lack the language to describe it. Disappearing is what the weak do. It is frantic, quiet, in the wrong way, the exit of someone who never had much presence to begin with. Withdrawing is something else entirely. It is the deliberate removal of something that had become structural, something the other person built their sense of normalcy around, without ever stopping to acknowledge it. When that withdrawal happens, the disruption is not emotional first. It is architectural. The space does not feel emptier. It feels wrong, off balance. Like a room where the furniture has been removed and the walls suddenly look too far apart. The person left standing in it cannot always explain what changed. Only that something did. Something significant. Something they cannot simply rearrange their way out of. What made your silence so disorienting to them was not its suddenness, it was its contrast. You had given consistently, without ledger, without the kind of conditional availability that most people quietly trade on. That history of giving made your absence legible in a way that the absence of someone who never gave fully simply cannot be. Presence, when it is genuine, becomes load-bearing. It supports things the other person never consciously decided to rest upon it. Their sense of being known, their comfort with being imperfect, their quiet confidence that someone was paying attention. Remove that, and the structure does not collapse dramatically. It shifts, it settles unevenly, and they begin to notice in small and accumulating ways that something they relied upon without ever naming it is no longer there to rely upon. That recognition does not arrive as grief immediately. It arrives first as irritation, then confusion, then something closer to the truth. The tension that lives inside this kind of silence is rarely discussed because it cuts in two directions at once. There is the part of you that still wanted to be seen, that had spent considerable time and emotional energy trying to be understood by someone who processed that effort as ordinary. And there is the other part, the quieter part, that began to recognize something uncomfortable. That the moment you became unreachable, you communicated more than you ever had. Every explanation you had offered, every attempt to articulate your value, every conversation that ended without resolution, none of it landed the way one moment of genuine, unannounced withdrawal did. Not because silence is a tactic, but because presence, when it has been freely given for long enough, accrues a kind of weight that only becomes measurable when it is gone. You did not plan for that. You were simply exhausted, and the exhaustion turned out to be the most honest thing you ever expressed. Presence operates like currency in ways that most people only understand in retrospect. While it circulates freely, it is taken for granted, spent without thought, assumed without gratitude. The moment supply contracts without warning. The value becomes visible, not as regret necessarily, not always as longing, but as a sharp, sudden awareness that what was available is no longer available, and that nothing in the immediate environment can perform the same function. That awareness is not something you engineered. It is simply what happens when something real is removed from a life that had quietly organized itself around it. The silence did not make a statement. It revealed one. A statement that had been true the entire time, waiting for the right conditions to become impossible to ignore. There is a particular kind of loss that does not soften with time. Not because the person was perfect. They weren't. Not because the relationship was without fault. It was full of them. But because something happened during that connection that cannot be undone. Something that altered the internal architecture of how a person experiences closeness. Most people call this heartbreak and wait for it to pass. But some losses don't pass. They settle. They become the quiet measuring rod against which every subsequent experience is unknowingly held. This is not sentimentality. This is not weakness. This is something far more precise, a psychological reconfiguration that most people never find the language for, and so they carry it in silence, convinced that something is wrong with them for not being able to simply move on. Not every person who enters your life occupies the same kind of space. Most people arrive, matter for a time, and leave without fundamentally altering the standard by which you understand intimacy. But occasionally, rarely, someone arrives who does not simply occupy space in your inner world. They rewrite it. When a person makes you feel genuinely known, not performed for, not managed, but actually seen, something in the psyche shifts that cannot be voluntarily reversed. The mind recalibrates. It now knows what is possible. And once it knows, it cannot unknow. Every person who follows is measured, unconsciously and automatically, against that revised standard. This is not loyalty to someone. It is loyalty to a version of yourself that only existed in their presence, a version you have not been able to fully locate since. What makes this so quietly devastating is that no amount of rational decision-making resolves it. You can understand, intellectually, that a relationship ended for legitimate reasons. You can acknowledge the person was flawed, the dynamic imperfect, the ending correct. The mind accepts all of this. And still, someone laughs a certain way, or pauses before speaking in a familiar rhythm, and the comparison arrives before you can stop it. Not because you are living in the past, because the past reconfigured the present. The original cannot be replaced. It can only be mimicked, poorly, by everything that follows. Here is where most people get the narrative wrong. When someone of depth and presence is released from a relationship, let go for something more manageable, more convenient, less demanding. The natural interpretation is insufficiency, that they were not enough. But the psychology suggests something more precise. They were not released because they were too little. They were released because they were too much, not in volume, but in what they required of the other person simply by existing. Depth demands depth, and many people, when confronted with someone who genuinely reconfigures their standard, retreat, not out of indifference, but out of an inability to rise to what the connection was asking of them. This is the grief that rarely gets named. Not the grief of loving someone who did not love you back, but the grief of being someone's highest standard, their quiet, unspoken measure of what intimacy could be, while never being their chosen reality. They knew the value. They simply could not carry the weight of it. The mind holds the shape of what it gave up longer than what it kept. We remember the edges of absence more clearly than the texture of presence, because absence is where the mind continues to reach and finds nothing. The incompleteness is the memory. It persists not as longing, but as a structural awareness, a knowledge held quietly in the body of what was once possible. And that knowledge does not require resolution. It does not require the other person to return, to acknowledge, or to change. It only requires you to stop interpreting your own depth as damage. Some things do not end because they failed. They end because one person could not sustain what the other had already become. The Joker archetype endures, not because audiences admire destruction, but because something in that figure recognizes a psychological truth most people are too afraid to examine directly. This is not a study in violence or nihilism. It is a study in what happens to a human being when they stop performing coherence for an audience that was never actually watching. When a person strips away the social contract of legibility, the unspoken agreement that you will make yourself understandable in exchange for belonging, what remains is a self that exists entirely on its own terms. And that self, precisely because it cannot be predicted, decoded, or managed, registers to others as something between threat and mystery, not because it is aggressive, because it is complete. There is a transition that occurs in certain people, slow, almost imperceptible, from seeking to be understood to simply being. Psychologists might call it individuation. Philosophers might call it sovereignty. What it actually feels like from the inside is a quiet, irreversible withdrawal of an old hunger. The hunger to be read correctly, the hunger to be seen accurately, the hunger that made you soften your silence, over-explain your decisions, justify your stillness. When that hunger dissolves, not through suppression but through genuine transcendence, the silence that replaces it is not emptiness. It is structure, an interior architecture so self-referential it no longer requires outside load-bearing walls. The fear most people carry, unspoken, rarely examined, is that being misunderstood is the same as being wrong, that if the people around you cannot decode you. This is perhaps the most effective cage ever constructed, because it requires no lock. The prisoner maintains it themselves, adjusting constantly, translating endlessly, trimming whatever would confuse the room. But there is a slow recognition available to those willing to sit inside the discomfort long enough. The most fully realized versions of a person are almost always misread, not because they are performing obscurity, but because genuine interior development moves faster and stranger than the interpretive frameworks of those still operating from the surface. The misreading is not a failure of the person. It is a measurement of the distance between where they are and where those watching them still stand. Chaos, in this context, is not what it appears. When the performance collapses, when the version of yourself built for external consumption finally becomes too exhausting to maintain, what emerges is not disorder. It is the first honest signal you have produced in years. The collapse of a constructed identity is not the loss of self. It is the loss of the substitute. And what the substitute was protecting you from was never actually dangerous. It was simply unfamiliar. The real thing always is what remains after all of it, the performance, the hunger, the slow dissolution of the need to be understood, is quieter than most people expect. Not triumphant, not resolved, just present. Operating from an interior that was always there, waiting beneath the noise of your own explanation. Growth is not synchronized. This is the part that no one prepares you for, that two people can share the same years and arrive in entirely different places because of them. One person remains where they were, shaped by comfort or avoidance, or simply the absence of pressure. The other is altered by the very weight of not being seen. And what happens, eventually, is that the altered one moves inward. They build something interior, a quieter self, less dependent on external confirmation, less porous to the opinions of people who couldn't be bothered to look closely before. They do not announce this shift. It happens slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way scar tissue forms, not visible until you press against it and find something harder than what used to be there, and then at precisely the moment that interior work is complete, the recognition arrives. It is almost surgical in its timing, as if the universe required the wound to close before sending the apology. The cruelest part is not the lateness, it is the internal conflict the lateness produces. Because even after everything, even after the long silence and the slow departure and the quiet reconstruction, there is still a part that registers their arrival as significant, not transformative, not welcome necessarily, but significant. The desire to be wanted does not fully dissolve, as if the universe required the wound to close before sending the apology. The cruelest part is not the lateness, it is the internal conflict the lateness produces. Because even after everything, even after the long silence and the slow departure and the quiet reconstruction, there is still a part that registers their arrival as significant, not transformative, not welcome necessarily, but significant. The desire to be wanted does not fully dissolve, simply because being wanted no longer serves you. It remains vestigial, like a reflex. And so you sit with both things simultaneously, the pull of their recognition and the deep settled knowledge that returning would undo precisely what the leaving built. This is not confusion. This is the most honest form of clarity a person can carry. It is the awareness that some doors once closed from the inside cannot be reopened without losing the architecture of the room. There is a philosophical distinction worth sitting with here between a realization arriving as a gift and a realization arriving as evidence. When someone finally sees your value at the moment you no longer need them to, their recognition does not rewrite the years in which it was absent. It confirms them. It is not a gift of understanding. It is proof of a longer truth, that the seeing was always possible. And what prevented it was not blindness, but priority. Timing in this way is not incidental. Timing is data. It tells you not just what someone now feels, but what they chose repeatedly before feeling it. And once you understand that, peace becomes less about their arrival and more about your own departure, not from them, but from the version of yourself that waited. Being chosen late is not the same as being chosen. The distinction is subtle enough to be ignored and significant enough to alter everything. Some people arrive with recognition in hand, like it is currency that still spends. And maybe it once would have. But the account has been closed, not in anger, not in punishment, but because you no longer operate on their timeline. You found somewhere in the silence that you had already chosen yourself, and that quiet, unremarkable, and entirely your own was the only choice that ever actually counted.